Hello and welcome back to Hebrew Grammar through Implicit Learning and Elaborative Encoding. This is a very simple way to grasp biblical Hebrew, the grammar therein, and the text of the Old Testament text, so that you might be able to read God's Word in the original language to nourish your soul. At the very outset of this course and the textbook that we're discussing through, I noted that biblical Hebrew and fluency of biblical Hebrew is actually a reading type of fluency. This is one of the concepts that we get from modern linguistic pedagogy, from third language or second language acquisition. We learn that certain languages and what we call fluency of the language, especially the older languages, it's held within can you read the text, because nobody is speaking, dare I say, biblical Hebrew or speaking biblical Koine Greek or speaking, for instance, ancient Aramaic or speaking Latin. Those are reading-based languages. And so fluency is determined whether or not you can read the text, understand the text, and enjoy the text, for a lack of better terms. And so one of the principles that we have within our textbook that we're going to discuss today is a principle that we call the Nehemiah principle. The Nehemiah principle. I love Nehemiah. I love this particular verse. And the verse that we're going to talk about to guide us through this principle is Nehemiah chapter 8, verse 8. And it says, "And they read from the book of the law of God clearly, and they gave the sense so that the people might understand the reading." This is actually, and this is why I have the cover of our textbook here, this is actually the Hebrew verse that is on the cover of the text, because we believe that reading Hebrew is the goal. Reading Hebrew is the goal, not necessarily translating Hebrew. If you can read it, you'll gain a sense of it. If you read it well, read it clear, then you can also help other people gain a sense and understanding of the text. And so how do we do this? How do we apply the Hebrew principle, the Nehemiah principle, to biblical Hebrew? Well, Nehemiah principle, for lack of better terms, is how do you use biblical Hebrew in hermeneutics? How do you use biblical Hebrew in hermeneutics? Here's the three things that we see from Nehemiah 8:8 that I want us to walk through for this particular principle. Read it clearly, understand it, and then give sense of it. Read it clearly, understand it, and then give sense of it. Now, I had noted earlier on in one of our prior videos that until I was about halfway through my doctorate, I hadn't really in class or out loud or with other people read the Hebrew grammar, read the Hebrew Bible out loud. I was trying desperately to translate every single day, and my professors would say, "Here's a verse, go translate it. Here's a verse, go translate it. Here's a passage, go translate it." Versus, I want you to read it. And so in my courses, I have my students read to one another for 30 minutes a week, and they're not translating it. They're just literally reading the Hebrew text. Read it clearly. Again, your eyes will lie to you, but your ears will hear. And so as you read it clearly out loud. You will begin connecting the grammatical principles together and the words and the vocabulary. And then we can delve into now what we call the Nehemiah principle, where you give understanding of it, you understand it, and then you give understanding of it from God's Word in the biblical Hebrew language. As we give sense of the biblical text before us, just as we saw in Nehemiah 8:8, and this is somebody reading the Hebrew text and they're holding a stick there. The stick, if you notice at the very end of it, it has a hand on it. So this is actually literally called a yod, which means hand in Hebrew. This is a yod, and because they don't touch the Hebrew Bible or the text on the Bible page, they use a pointer as they read in synagogue or at home or in yeshiva. But as you read through the biblical text, these are the things that I want you to pay attention to for hermeneutics, for giving sense of it, to understanding the biblical text rightly. Pay attention to words, phrases, clauses, sentences, discourse, that's conversation, and syntax. Let's walk through some of these different things for us. And I have exercises for you within the textbook where you'll look at different passages. But nevertheless, let's look at some examples here on the screen together. First, begin with names. Begin with names. We talked about this before whenever we began this process of learning biblical Hebrew, and said that Hebrew names, be it of persons, places, they are what we call portmanteau, which is multiple words conjoined together. If you split it apart, you will be able to see and learn much of the narrative text that is before you. And so I have in quotes here, Hebrew's narrative, quote, secret key is often held within the names of the persons in the narrative. Again, if you don't know what narrative is simply put the stories. So we're talking about, the stories of Jericho, the stories of the Exodus, the stories of David and Benjamin, the stories of people, right? Often these stories, the names that are within the stories, now there's sometimes it's not the case, but often the names within the stories gives us great depth to understanding what is happening. One of the books and places that I go in class is to the book of Ruth. In the book of Ruth, these are names here on the left hand of your screen. These are names of the people within the story of Ruth, as well as at the very bottom, Bethlehem. And these names tell us what is happening with these characters, right? So Elimelech is the name of the husband, the father in the story. My God is king. And yet, in irony form, he doesn't trust that God will reign and bring them through the famine that is in the land. And so he flees. He flees to the land of Moab, right? Which Moab is like the father or from the father in that instance, okay? Then we have the wife's name, the mother's name is Naomi, okay, which is my daughter's middle name, Naomi. Noemi is how we say it in Spanish. And then the two sons, sadly, one is Mechlon and the other is Chilchion, sickness and destruction. And so whenever the two sons die, if you know Hebrew and you read the two sons die, you go, well, no duh. One was sick and the other was a destroyer, so he would be destroyed. It's just on point with their names in this way. Ruth, who some people translate Ruth's name as friend. In this instance here on the screen, I've translated Ruth's name as being grief. Either one would work really well for highlighting Ruth's character in the story. If she's the friend, she sticks closer than a friend to Naomi through the entirety of the story. She doesn't leave her and go back to her home as Naomi bids her. Rather, she stays with her. So if she's friend, that's fitting, but also grief. And we see that this poor lady, Ruth, who the book is named after, has much grief. And so whenever you begin reading the book and you say the book of Ruth, if you know Hebrew, immediately you're going to say, oh, this is a book about grief, if that's the particular translation you prefer. And I do in this instance. We have then Orpah, or Orpah. Orpah, it means fawn. And fawns, if you've ever been walking through the woods and ran into some deer, we live here in Oklahoma and there's lots of deer around us. And the fawns, man, if they see you or hear a car or something like that, they're gone. They're fast away, just like Jonah being a dove, right? And so, Orpah takes off. The moment that she gets to go home, she's like, bye, see ya, gone. We don't hear from her ever again. Then we have the guy who is the Redeemer, and his name is Boaz. Boaz literally in Hebrew is in strength. In strength. And so in strength, he saves this family. He saves Naomi and he saves Ruth. He, in strength, undoes the grief of and of Ruth, right? And then we finally see Bethlehem, which is the town where they're from, ultimately the city of David, right? Bethlehem. And so this really points to the irony of the beginning of the story that when there was a famine in the land, this family, who the father's name is My God is King, leaves the land where it is the house of bread. The one place that God would provide food, aka the bread bowl of Israel, they leave that place. Like, why would you leave the place that is the bread bowl of your country to go to Moab, which is probably like modern day Jordan, very desert looking and not exactly the place that you would expect there to be much flowing of milk and honey if we were to use Old Testament Torah terms. So the names in the story, I want you to look them up. If you can't figure out what the names mean, I would push you to just use Google. Type into Google King Asa, and then you will find a page about him, and inevitably you will find several different definitions of their name. Look at it, and then read the definition of their name into the story that you're reading. Isaiah, man of Yahweh. Who shall we send? Who will go for us? Here am I, send me, says Isaiah. And he is now called the man of God. because he is God's representative. And so the names go along like that. It's wonderful for us to apply. Another name that I love is Samuel, right? Samuel, Shmar, or Shema. So you either have Shmar or Shema. And my president, Dr. Heath Thomas, thinks that it's Shema in that instance. Yahweh heard, or God heard the cry of Hannah, Samuel's mother. And I think that's good. Or it could be God guarded her, Shmar'el. So that's perfectly fine either way. The name gives us, I see why he's called Samuel. Because his name fits there. Likewise, if we jump to the New Testament. You shall call him Jesus, Yeshua. Yeshua is the Aramaic / Koine version of Yahshua, the Old Testament Hebrew Joshua, which is Yahweh saves. Yahweh saves. So yeah, whenever you believe in the name of the Lord Jesus Christ, you are believing in the power of God to save you through the personhood, the actions, the life, death, burial, and resurrection of Jesus Christ, because Yeshua, Yahweh saves. So number one, as we apply that Nehemiah principle to understand it well, because you're already reading it out loud, to understand it well, pay attention to the names. Number two, pay attention to words, not just names. Pay attention to certain words. Now, some words you're going to encounter them, and it's just rather blasé to be rather plain, right? So, for instance, we see, suddenly now it is Derek. Derek just means way or road. I don't know that there's that much to glean from that one word, Derek. But there are words in many passages that it's not a name, but nevertheless, this one word is a really important linchpin, if we could use that term, to help you understand the biblical text. Here's the few that my students in hermeneutics class have to look up in Hebrew. We have Goel, which is Redeemer from the story of Ruth and other stories. As, for instance, we can see Goel, redemption happening with Abraham, redemption happening with Tamar, and the list goes on. Berit, which is covenant. I wrote my dissertation in regards to covenants within prophetic literature, especially in regards to the book of Habakkuk, where there is not the word berit, but in other texts we find the word berit. What is a berit? What is a covenant? What is the word Sheol? And we see that there in Hebrew, the next one down. What is Sheol? Behold, if I go to Sheol, you are there. Is that hell? Is that the grave? Is that the place of the dead? There's a lot of discussion and debate in that passage, and so I would encourage you to look that word up. We have Hakma or Hakama, if we want to give a different inflection of it, depending upon your type of Hebrew you're taught, which is wisdom. What is Hakma? What is wisdom? In the ancient world, in Hebrew. This has a lot of weight on these passages. And give ear to my words so that you might learn wisdom, Proverbs chapter 1, right? What is wisdom? What is the hakmah that he's hoping his son learns from him? Last one at the bottom, we have ruach. Ruach could be spirit, wind, breath. And so we have Haruach Elohim, right? The Spirit of God was over Beimayim, was hovering over the waters. That's Genesis 1. Well, if it's just the wind is over the waters, then that's interesting. But whenever we as Trinitarians read the text and see that the Spirit of God was there, then that as a Trinitarian, I read that and say, the Spirit, as soon as the creation began, was indwelling in the creation. And likewise, Haruach Elohim is what is breathed into Adam. The Spirit of God, the breath of God is breathed into him. And so this has a lot of connotations as well on text. And so pay attention to words that are not just blasé words. And it's really difficult to know what is a blasé word or not. There are some commentaries out there. I have a commentary on my shelf in the office that is called the Keyword Commentary. That is something that you might be able to purchase through Logos or in paper form or something of that sort, where in the text of each passage, it'll say, this is a really important word for you to look up. That's a great idea as well. So first, I want you to look up names. Second, look up words that are important in the text. Third, I want you to consider verbs. Now, we're not going to delve deeply into this because we've already done the Hezekiah principle, the Jonah principle. We already did the Jericho principle. We've already walked through the Noah and Nimrod principle, and we talked about the different types of verbs that are in Hebrew. And Hebrew has a lot of types of verbs. That's why we have so many principles that are hung upon the verb as far as grammar goes. But when you read a text, Ask yourself the question, who's doing the verb and what veracity, what intensity level? Again, remember we have that kill chart that is quack neck, pippity pop, hippity hop, hip pi hell. Is it regular? Is it passive? Is it intense? Is it causal, right? Is it reflexive? I bathe myself. It's both active and passive. I'm bathing and I'm receiving being bathed. Pay attention to the verbs and find, oh, I see. That's what's happening there. For instance, we also talked about in the Noah and Nimrod that not always are the ing verbs evident in English. But the ing, like he was persistently suffering. He was persistently being guarded, right? Guarding. But that would be a passive ing. And so pay attention to the verbs because it will give you a really neat inflection to the text. Next, I want you to, here's our chart, by the way. Yeah, quack, neck, pippity pop, hippity hop, hip pi el. That's a very easy way to memorize it. Next thing that we do, so again, Nehemiah principle, you read it out loud clearly. Number 2, you get understanding of it. And so to get understanding of the text, sometimes you have to look at the discourse. Discourse, for lack of better terms, in my opinion, is dialogue. Dialogue. And I know that's probably not correct to all of our other grammarians out there, but dialogue. How is this conversation flowing back and forth? One of the places that I like to go and look at the dialogue and how it changes is we have Moses and Aaron going to Pharaoh. If you remember back before he met up with his brother and went into the court, Moses says, Yahweh, I can't speak. I have a speech impediment. I'm scared, yada, yada. And so then God says, but I'll send your brother with you, Aaron. Take him with you. And then Moses turns around and does the talking. Well, that's important to note that he at first says he can't do the talking, and then he does the talking. What does that mean? It means that God has, emboldened him. God has encouraged him. I think this means we need community to do God's will together. Nevertheless, discourse analysis comes back and forth in that place. Another great, fun, easy discourse analysis to go look at and read is the conversation between Nathan and David after the death of Uriah and the raping of Bathsheba. You are the man. And that discourse there back and forth has a lot of wordplay that is happening there. Hebrew narrative uses something that is called the vav consecutive or the vav reflexive, okay? We had talked about the vav all the way back in what I call the Hey Abimelech principle. Those are the letters that might magnetize onto the front of a word. Oftentimes, they're the letters that are prepositions, such as the beit, the kof, the mem, the lamed, the hey of the v. But there's also the vav, the hey and Abimelech principle. The vav is and. And I want you to recognize, and I'm sure we've already talked about this in the reading sessions, but when you see a vav beginning a sentence, if it's a vav followed by an imperfect, the author of the text wants you to relive the text, right? But if it's a vav followed by a perfect, then it is imperfect. So the vav actually flips the tense of the verb that precedes the vav right there. And so here's for instance, Leviticus 19, chapter 19, verse 1. Vayedavar Yahweh el Moshe le amor. And the word, and spoke Yahweh to Moses to say. And spoke Yahweh to Moses to say. Now notice, he spoke. I have it translated there in perfect tense, even though it has a yod at the front side, meaning it's imperfect. It hasn't happened yet. But if we were reading it and literally translating it, we would literally translate it, ignoring the fact of the vav consecutive. We would literally translate it and say, and Yahweh will speak to Moses. Or maybe, and now Yahweh's speaking, or is spoken, or present tense to Moses. The author of the text is inviting us to enjoy this. Now, the vav consecutive and vav reversal also helps point us towards foreground and background material of the discourse, of the story, of the narrative. So when the narrative uses past tense verbs, this is called foreground material. Foreground material. This has already happened. It's laying down, this is what's going on, right? So, for instance, if we go back to the book of Ruth, in the time when the judges were judging, So while it's an ing, it's also it kind of has the connotation that it has been going on. It's background material there because it's pointing that it has gone on. It is still going on. So for instance, we could say background material back to the David and Nathan and Bathsheba thing. At the time when kings had gone to war, David is in his palace. Background material because it's past tense there in the text. Foreground material is going to be giving us what is happening now, right? Foreground events are the most important facts for the development of the plot. Often these flow in succession, such as, for example, this happened, and then this happened, etc., etc., etc. Again, we're talking about imperfect, and then, right? This is that vayahi is what we, or vayiktul, or something along those lines. And so then it was, and then it was, and then it was. Hebrew loves to do that. Some of my friends make the argument that maybe that's why Matthew does this. Maybe Matthew is either thinking in Hebrew or Matthew was originally written in Hebrew Aramaic, because Matthew has a lot of the, and then Jesus did this, and then Jesus said that, and then this happened, and then that happened. I don't know. I'm not a Matthew scholar, but I think that is a really great catch from the dialogue that is happening in the text. Background material, okay? Background material, it will often have some changes. We will often see clauses come to it, right? Verbless clauses, participial clauses, perfect clauses, imperfect clauses. Clauses end up pointing us to the background material, even though we've already covered now we're into the foreground. And so he went, and then he did that, and then she did that. But we have maybe a participial phrase, because she was hungry, or because she was, eating. And so we have this, he went off that direction because it was the time of war. Those clauses are background material held within foreground material situations of the and then, the vayiktuls, the vayamoers, the vayas, all those types of things, the vav with the imperfect marker that comes right after it. So the next thing, again, Nehemiah principle, read it out loud, clearly, practice your pronunciation, and I'm going to do my best as we read together. Number 2, you need to get an understanding of it. So we get understanding by looking at names, words, verbs, dialogue or conversation as we might call it. And now we're looking finally at syntax. Syntax for a really elementary version. Again, this is an extremely easy form of Hebrew grammar. Syntax is flow and structure of sentences. That's my K5 version of how to understand this. Syntax, okay, is often going to have subordinate clauses. In English, subordinate clauses are marked with conjunctions such as and, after, although, because, before, if, since, when, while, etc. Hebrew utilizes the same types of things to change the structure of a verse and then point you towards something that is big that is happening. So you can look for these words. These are words that you've already learned in vocabulary up to this point. Lefini, ki, keasher, luli, ad, le aman. We have ahari after these things. Im, asher. We have lu. We have lekaim. We have pain. These words, when you see them, designate in your mind, okay, the author is about to make a point in the sentence. The author is about to make a point in the sentence, and we need to pay attention to what comes after these markers. That's an extremely basic thing to pay attention to. If you see one of these words come up, a designator, pay attention to what follows it, because the author is trying to make a point to you, okay? But then whenever we talk about syntax, we can also talk about word order. Hebrew prefers verb then subject in the word order of verses or sentences, okay? Verb then subject. Sometimes you will read in your Hebrew Bible and you will notice it will start out with a subject, then a verb. When Hebrew breaks the norm, as in any language, when grammar is broken, it is because the author of that particular verse, sentence, whatever is happening, is making a point. So let's consider some of these options. So this is standard Hebrew order. You'll have a verb followed by the subject, the one doing the verb, followed by the direct object, the one receiving the action of the verb. So let's look at this passage right here. Genesis 1:4. Vayara Elohim et haor. Vayara Elohim et haor. And we see here, and God saw the light. I don't have the entirety of the verse there for you, but and God saw the light. And so we see here, we have yara is the imperfect to see, yara. So who saw? God. It's the subject comes after the verb. Saw who or what? The direct object marker is the et. God saw who or what? He saw haor, the light. Okay, so we have verb, subject, direct object to follow. Another passage to consider, again, with verb, subject, object following thereafter would be Exodus 9:1. Vayomer Yahweh el Moshe. Vayomer Yahweh el Moshe. And so in this instance we have and spoke. Who spoke? Yahweh spoke. To whom? To Moses, el Moshe. Okay, so we have verb, subject, and then we have the direct object who is receiving the action that is at hand. Another passage, Genesis 1:5. Vayikra Elohim leor yom lehoshech kara lila. And this literally would translate over to and called God to the light day, and to the darkness hoshek he called night. Now notice how that flows. He called, who called? Yahweh called what? He called the light, ha'or, or la'or, to the light. Okay, so we have verb, subject, direct object is the recipient of that text. Another for us to see really easily here is 2 Kings 3:22. Vayishkmiu be bochar ve hashmoshe Hashemesh Zaracha al Hamayim upon the waters. Again, this is slightly small on my screen to read. I apologize. And when they rose in the morning, the sun shined upon the water. And so we see the to rise up there. Okay, and this is Shechum. And so we have the rising up. They rose up when? In the morning. So now we kind of have a designator as to when they did the verb. And they rose up in the morning, and then the sun had shone on the water. And so this is the word order. So verb, subject, who's doing it, and who's receiving it. Okay. So another one. We end up getting deviations. So again, when the Hebrew breaks the norm of verb, subject, object, and switches to, say, for instance, right here before us, subject, verb, object, your ears need to perk up and you need to pay attention. This is Nehemiah principle. You're getting understanding of the text before you teach and help people understand the text. Let's look at an example here before us. Job chapter 1, verse 1. Ish haya be'eretz uz Iyov shmo. Iyov shmo. Literally, this is man. Man lived in the land of Uz. Iyov, his Job, Shmo in this instance. Shmo. Job was his name. Job was his name. So I'm supplying the was at this instance. So we see man. So we see verb. We see subject, ish. Then we see verb, haya, to be. Then we see who is. We jump all the way over. Job is the direct object. Okay, Job is the man that lives in this place here. Okay, we often get breaks in narratives. Breaks can end up being something that is placed there so that you might take a break in the narrative action, so that you might be able to have a story, so that you might be able to breathe. There might be extra information thrown in there. One of the big instances that I often think about is whenever we read the story of Joseph, I believe it is, that there's a sudden break in there with a couple other smaller stories from the patriarchal period. We get that kind of often, and this is a break in the narrative. It's kind of the split over, and you have one episode TV style that is covering other people in other places, but then you go back to your main characters of that instance. Breaks in narratives are designated by the uncommon subject-verb object. The uncommon subject-verb object. Here's an instance of it here in 2 Kings 3:21. This is a break in the text. V'chol Moav shma'u ki alu hamalachim lehelechem bam. Lehelechem bam. What we see happening here is that suddenly there's a break, and it's like, oh, and by the way, the Moabites had heard that the kings had come to fight them. So it's a break in the narrative. And how do we know it's a break in the narrative? Because it switches the order from being verb-subject to being subject-verb. Again, the author is drawing our attention to, okay, pay attention to what's happening here in our text. Another one for us to consider is 2 Samuel 18:18, right? 2 Samuel 18:18. Ve Abshlim lekach vayitzav lo bechayim et mitzvat et mazevet. Sorry. Et mazevet. Again, small screen. And Absalom, he's going to do this. Absalom is, in his lifetime, taking and setting up a pillar or an altar, we could put it that way. And so how do we know that this is a side story within, I believe this is in the middle of the Davidic notations, okay? We know that it's a side story because it starts out, and Absalom does this. All right? And so whenever we think about the Nehemiah principle, we need to pay attention to the fact that we read the text clearly, we understand the text, and then we articulate the text in a clear way for those that we are helping read God's word. This is the Nehemiah principle and how to use Hebrew for your personal study. I'll see you in the next video. Bye-bye.